A standoff between the 13 colonies over the right to self-govern and have financial freedoms turns into a global conflict that forges a confederacy that will birth the United States. In the video prior, we covered the acts that led to the increasing tensions between Britain and the colonies. The overall limited intervention from the British, along with resource-rich land and a population that had a high rate of literacy, made the colonies the richest and most prosperous place in the world for their time. They understood fully the banking principles of their time and had revolutionized some of their own. The tensions grew between the British colonies each time new taxes and proclamations were forced on the colonies. When the Parliament carved out the tea market and gave the monopoly to the East India Trading Company, the line had been crossed. The colonies refused, with force, to be a cash cow for the British monarchy and the banking cartel that had wed it. The Boston Tea Party, organized by the Sons of Liberty, was the final act of resistance that the Parliament and the Crown could not accept. The Boston Harbor was shut down, Massachusetts' governing body was dissolved, and the people of the colonies were required to pay back the damages. This was a step too far. The closed harbor stopped all trade to the Massachusetts colonies. All of the colonies, for some time, had self-governments of their own accord up until now. Each colony saw that the act and threatened their way of life and their ability to be masters of their own land. But there's something absurd in supposing that a continent be perpetually governed by an island. Thomas Paine. The colonies would send delegates to the Continental Congress. Militias and minutemen would be readied, and the skirmish of Lexington and Concord would take place. The primary purpose of the militias being readied was to ensure future losses of liberty could be prevented, mostly by a show of force, but, if necessary, using that force. This is not a rundown of the war or its tactics, but it will provide enough context to understand fully the future information. Few, if any, on a grand scale were thinking of revolution in 1775. Its fever would not be spawned until late 1775 and 1776. George Washington would be commanding the army that did not receive its name, the Continental Army, for almost a year. The main objective was to march the army down to Boston through a show of force to negotiate for some of the primary objectives would have been Boston Harbor be reopened, local governments of Massachusetts be reinstated, the ability for the colonies to use their own monetary system not rigged to drain them of all their prosperity and specie, a promise of future liberties would be ensured, and the removal of all monopolies and overbearing taxes. In early 1775, most of the colonies thought themselves as part of England. After the British refusal to take them seriously, things escalated, and more of the colonies saw the advantages of separating from the crown. No one in England, much less London, wanted a civil war, as is clear from the papers of the day. As well in the colonies, no one wanted to fight a full-scale war in 1775. There is no doubt countless reasons for the tensions escalating, but we will lay it at the doorsteps of one main reason: the British inability to take the colonies seriously and allow the British general in the colonies to negotiate fully with them. This would be compounded by the slow communications across the ocean. This allowed for national fervor to grow in the colonies. In 1775, the colonies had 12 million pounds of specie in circulation in the colonies. As we remember, most of the paper currencies had been stopped by the crown and had been laid to rest. Lexington and Concord would take place in April. In June, George Washington would be named General of the Army and authorized bills of credit to fund short-term contracts for regulars. 12 colonies promised to repay the debts by these bills of credit over the next 7 years, called continentals. Before the year was done, they found it necessary to have another 2 million issued. All in total for the year, 3 million pounds had been printed. Virtually the next day after Washington had been instated, Bunker Hill would be fought, where the British won, but at a cost of 2,400 men, after attacking an American force of 1,000 in a fortified position. This would haunt the British High Command in Boston and keep them from confronting a dug-in American force for the remainder of the next year. The Olive Branch Petition. Congress issued a petition declaring loyalty to the King George III and stated its hope that he would help arrange a reconciliation and prevent further hostilities against the colonies. 4 months later, King George rejected the petition and declared the colonies in rebellion. In 1775, the two armies, the British in Boston and George Washington and his men on the outskirts. The year would be a standoff in the British High Command, and George Washington would look through opticals at one another for the remainder of the year. 1776, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. General Knox brings cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, where they are set up overnight in the heights overlooking Boston. the British retreat to New York. Many of the soldiers were not signing on for another contract, and George Washington struggled to keep his army together. Paying the soldiers consistently, much less on time, would have greatly helped, as Washington would express continually to Congress. 1776, July 4th, the Declaration of Independence is signed. The now-named Continental Army would march down to New York and dig in. The lack of training and poor leadership would become obvious. Many of the lower officers were voted on by the men. This kept the popular and lax leaders among the men in charge on the lower ranks. The Continental Army was ill-equipped and without uniforms. Some of the soldiers were being armed with pikes for lack of muskets and ammunition. An American soldier had 1/6 the experience of the opposing Redcoat Army regular. In August, the British fleet was spotted outside New York, the largest army ever assembled to date. It would be the largest British naval task force assembled until D-Day, 400 ships carrying 32,000 troops. When I look down and see the prodigious fleet that they have collected, I cannot help but being astonished that people should travel 3,000 miles in such risk, trouble, and expense to rob, plunder, and destroy another people because they would not lay down their lives and fortunes at their feet. Joseph Reed. What may have been an attempt to awe the Americans into submission had backfired. Instead of inducing a surrender from the show of force, they inspired the Americans and bolstered their resolve. In the Battle of Long Island, the American forces faced the British forces for the first time. For many British soldiers, this would be their first taste of battle. The British had not been in a war since the 7 Years' War. General Howe would take his troops around the Jamaica Pass and outflank the rebels. Before the rout could be finished, the British army stopped for the night. General Washington evacuated the remaining forces, not captured or killed, by boat under the cover of a dark fog. It was no small miracle that it succeeded without the British discovering their departure. The Americans had escaped the jaws of destruction. They simply needed to not lose, and they would succeed. The British needed a decisive, crushing victory, followed by a moderate and expensive occupation to keep the colonies. In 1776, the Continental Congress would print £6 million to finance the war. This being on top of the £12 million of specie, £3 million printed the prior year. The currency supply in the colonies had nearly doubled. The Continental fell in value and was discounted 25% against specie. Despite this increase in the printed currency, Washington still struggled to gather supplies and keep his men paid on time. Washington was losing men and the war. Many of the army's enlistments were up after Christmas. Washington desperately needed a victory. He understood that the colonies needed a victory as well as the army did. Each of the colonies had large militia forces, but kept them at home as they did not feel confident in Washington's performance and to keep their own land safe. The war dragged on into the winter, and it was decided to cross the frozen Delaware in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve to attack Trenton, where 1,000 German mercenaries, known as Hessians, were spending the winter. The American forces would succeed, and 900 German soldiers and supplies would be captured. The news circulated in the colonies, and spirits rose. On the 31st, Washington appealed to his men, whose enlistments were to expire at the end of the year. Stay for just another 6 weeks, and for an extra bounty of $10. His appeal would work, and most of the men agreed to stay. This was a promise that Washington had no authority to do so. In an odd twist, the Congress would grant him such liberties later that week, unknowingly. This would give Washington nearly dictatorial powers. The British army massed at Princeton, prepared to attack the Americans in the morning. Washington, as a small part of his army, engaged in skirmishes with the British as they marched towards Trenton, delaying them until late that day. After three failed attempts to cross the bridge over the Assunpink Creek, the British stopped for the night and expected to win another easy victory in the morning for a second time. Washington orders 500 men to stay, to keep the fires lit, and to have digging commence during the night. The British believed that the Americans were digging in for conflict in the morning. Washington marches his soldiers behind the British and attacks Princeton, where there was only 1,400 British troops. This would lead to an immediate second American victory. The Battle of Trenton and Princeton were a boost in morale for the Continental troops, leading to many new recruits joining the Continental Army in that spring. When talking about the impact of the victories at Trenton and Princeton, that it may be no doubt whether so small a number of men were ever employed in so short a time with greater and more lasting effect upon the history of the world. British historian Sir George Trevelyan. The American forces were no longer seen as a force that could be brushed aside, but as a piece to a war that was far from over. In June 14, 1777, Congress would adopt the American flag. The British would attack Philadelphia, and a battle would be fought for Saratoga, and the British would surrender. To support the war effort, another 13 million pounds of colonial script were printed. Their values dropped 3-1 against specie. In 1778, The French ally with the Americans in the British attempt to make peace, promising to repeal the Tea Act and coercive acts, and promising not to tax the Americas. America is no longer interested in returning to a British colony, and the commissioners returned to Britain unsuccessful. The Battle of the Monmouth. When British headed for New York, Washington left Valley Forge and followed. That year, another 64 million notes would be printed and their value would fall to a meager 40-1. This is where the term, not worth a continental, came to be. It was said that a wagon load of money could scarcely afford a wagon load of provisions. The British began their southern strategy commencing in late 1778 with the capturing of Savannah, Georgia. 1779. The Spanish joined the war after their appeal for Gibraltar to the British in exchange for help in the war effort is denied. After being turned down, they entered the war on the side of the Americans, making this a global conflict with theaters in America, Europe, India, and many key colonies around the globe. Another 124 million notes are printed, totaling over 5 years, 224 million notes flooding the colonies. Hyperinflation occurs, price freezes are enforced by governments, and products are no longer accessible. In another 2 years, they will be discounted at 179-1, virtually useless. On top of this, the states printed their own currencies. This added another 210 million total to the amount of currency in circulation. The army was no longer able to requisition supplies needed and began issuing certificates. These, being a promise to pay, thus became their own form of currency. The states would also do the same, adding 200 million in worthless certificates to the currency supply. Loan certificates were turned to by the Continental Congress, issuing 600 million in the final years of the war. Merchants were forced to accept them because the Congress would not pay with anything else. The British continued in the south and took Charleston. The conflict was drawn to a close after the surrender of General Clinton in Yorktown in 1778, where the American forces were greatly helped by the French navies. The saving grace of the early failed currencies is that they were allowed to fall into worthlessness, not being forced on par to the people or the governments, simply being abandoned. In our next video, we will cover the effects of all of this and the first acts of racketeering during the American War, with a Mr. Robert Morris taking advantage of his connections inside the government and his running of the bank to make money off the death and sorrow of war. The American conflict for independence is over. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to drop a like and subscribe and check out all our other content.